So we are on DAF Yud Beis Amud Aleph, and yesterday we were discussing the machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua as to when the world was created. According to Rabbi Eliezer, the world was created in Tishrei, and according to Rabbi Yehoshua, the world was created in Nisan. I mentioned yesterday, and we're going to come back to this today, that Tosfos says, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim, and I'll explain to you why that is in just a moment. But the Gemara then had said, Va'azdu l'taymayu, they are consistent in this discussion because they talk about the flood. And in their discussion of the flood, Rabbi Eliezer said that it happened in Mar Cheshvan, which is the second month of the year, if you count beginning with Tishrei. And Rabbi Yehoshua says that the flood happened in Iyar, which is the second month counting from Nisan. So we had also seen that they disagree as far as in the way that God altered the natural order. And in other words, both agree that because the people of the world had perverted their behavior, God perverted and altered dramatically the laws of nature. But Rabbi Yehoshua is much easier to understand because he said that the flood occurred in the spring at a time when the water is drying up in the wells and in the well springs and so forth, and yet that was the reversal of the natural order, is that this was a time of great preponderance of water. And similarly, he said that there was a change in the natural order because normally Kima, the constellation of Kima that we talked about yesterday, is in the process of setting below the horizon during the day, and God caused it to come up, which was through this alteration of the astronomical fixtures of the stars. This was also what brought about this great cataclysm of a flood. But Rabbi Eliezer, who agrees with the fact that God changed the natural order, doesn't seem to indicate that there was any change in the natural order as far as the water or as far as the stars, because he says that it happened in the fall, which is a time when water surges anyway. And also, he agrees that since this is a time when the mazel of Kima, this constellation, is rising above the horizon, God also caused the constellation to rise and pull two stars out of it. So it doesn't seem to be as much of a change in the natural order as the way Rabbi Yehoshua was suggesting. So let's take a look. The Gemara we're on the fourth line of Yud Beis Amud Aleph. Bishlam ala Rabbi Yehoshua, Hainu dichsiv sheni. Now we know throughout the Torah, when the Torah describes to us the number of the month, it always counts from Nisan. So that works out well according to Rabbi Yehoshua, who says that when the Torah in Parshas Noach says that the flood began in the second month, it's the second month after Nisan, which is the month of Iyar. But according to Rabbi Eliezer, the second month is inaccurate because it was really in the 8th month according to him. So the Gemara answers, Sheni Ladin. No, it was the second month after the judgment. God decided that he was going to destroy mankind in Tishrei. So the second month after that decision was made, right, that's when God brought the flood. So now the next question. Bishlam ala Rabbi Yehoshua haina deshina ala Rabbi Eliezer ma'ishina. I can understand how God perverted the laws of nature, so to speak, because everything went against the natural order. At a time when the water is drying up, God brings the mabul. At a time when the constellation of Kima is supposed to descend, God causes it to ascend. But according to Rabbi Eliezer, what change in the natural order is there? Kid Rav Chizda, the answer is that there was another change in the natural order. Da Amar Rav Chizda, Beroschen kilkul v'roschen nidonu. That the people of the world at the time corrupted themselves with hotness or with heat, and therefore they were judged with heat or with boiling water. V'roschen kilkulu ba'avera uv'roschen nidonu. They sinned with heat, meaning that the heat of passion. It was their heated yetzer haras that caused them to sin. And it was, therefore, their judgment was to be judged with boiling water. The water of the mabul wasn't just that it flooded them, but it also killed them by boiling them. And how do I know this? Because the verb of vayashoku, which describes the water abating, is also described in terms of Achashverosh's anger abating after Haman is hanged. So therefore I know that the idea of anger, which is the heat of anger, that's why it's called chema from the word cham, right, is a reference also to the water of the mabul. Tana Rabbanan, Chachmei Yisrael monim lamabel karebi Eliezer v'latekufa karebi Yehoshua. Chachmei umos ha'olam monim af lamabel karebi Yehoshua. So the Bryce interestingly records a machlokus between Chachmei Yisrael and Chachmei umos ha'olam. We've seen this in Pesachim as well, that the wise men of Israel say one way and the wise men of the other nations say another way. And the Gemara doesn't tell us which one is accurate. It just says that both agree that when you want to count, when you want to reckon the astronomical tekufos, which means when you want to reckon as far as the seasons, you have to start counting from the time of creation, because each season is exactly 1/4 of a 365 and a quarter day year. And so therefore you want to know exactly when the first tekufa was. The first tekufa from the time of creation starts with Nisan. So they go like Rabbi Yehoshua, and this is universally agreed upon both by Chachmei Yisrael and Chachmei Umas Ha'olam. The machlokas between the two is as far as how I reckon the number of years since the time of the Mabul. The Chachmei Yisrael say that reckoning the number of years takes into account that the Mabul took place in the month of Mar Cheshvan, and therefore we count the number of years using the dates, assuming that Cheshvan was the time of the Mabul. So like Rashi explains, like Monim Shenos Noach Ubrias Olam Ushnos Hadoros Karabi Eliezer Monim Mitishrei Techilas Hashanim. V'lo mishum desfir lehu betishrei nivra ha'olam, ela de tishrei Rosh HaShana l'shanim uvenisam nivra ha'olam kirikatani. In other words, we paskin like Rabbi Yehoshua that the world was created in Nisan. But when we want to count the number of years, we count from Tishrei, because that's the beginning of years as far as counting historical records that take place in the Torah. In other words, if the Torah chronicles that something happened in a certain year, it's using Tishrei as the demarcation from year to year, of the start of a new year, if we want to start counting from the time of creation, or the time of the flood. Chachmei Umos Ha'olam, when they want to count their chronicles from the times of the flood, they chronicle the flood as having occurred in the month of Iyar. So it seems very clear from Rashi that the conclusion of the Gemara is that we paskin like Rabbi Yehoshua, that the world was created in Nisan. And the truth of the matter is that we paskin this way when it comes to one very important halacha. Does anyone know what that is? It's a very rare halacha, happens once every 28 years. Birkas Hachama. We do Birkas Hachama. Remember, it was just how many years ago? 6 years ago? We should be all zocha to be there for the next Birkas Hachama. Remember when we did it? We counted on Rosh, right at the beginning of Nisan. We do Birkas Hachama. We do Birkas Hachama because we say that the sun goes back to the original position that it was at the time of creation, which means that we acknowledge that the world was created, Sheishis Yimei Bereshis took place in Nisan, not in Tishrei. And this leads Tosfos. I was looking for this Tosfos yesterday. I couldn't find it because I finally remembered that it's on DAF Chav Zayin much later in Rosh HaShana. So if you'll do me a favor, just turn to DAF Chav Zayin Amud Aleph for just a second. Tosfos asked the question. Tosfos says, how can Rabbi Elazar HaKalir, who's the great liturgist who writes so many of the psalms and the hymns that we say throughout the year, how could he write about Rosh HaShana, Zeh Hayom Tchilas Ma'asecha? Today is the first day of your creation, God. If we paskin like Rabbi Yehoshua that the world was created in Nisan, how could you say that Rosh Hashanah is the time of creation? It doesn't fit in. So Tosfos says, we'll just look at the last few lines where it says Omer Rabbeinu Tam. It's the third Tosfos on the page on Chav Zayin Amud Aleph Divrei Maskil Keman. And if you look at the last 7 or 8 lines, it says Omer Rabbeinu Tam de'elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim. That both Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua are the words of the living God. V'ikol meimer de v'tishrei ala b'machshava livros v'lo nivra ad Nisan. That really, the way we paskin like Rabbi Yeshua is Rabbi Yeshua acknowledges that God's thought of creation started in Tishrei. But the actual physical fruition of God's thought, which of course is very cryptic, we don't understand what it means for God to think and not to do. Right? But whatever that means, God thought about the existence in Tishrei and brought it to physical fruition in Nisan. So in a sense, creation took place both in Tishrei and in Nisan. the thought creation took place in Tishrei, and the physical creation took place in Nisan. We say machshava kamaisa, right? So therefore, it's a type of creation. Tosfos just concludes by pointing out that we have the same kind of language when we talk about the creation of Adam. The Gemara says in Eruvin that it was Ola b'machshava livro shnayim ula basof lo nivra echad, that God originally thought about the creation of man as two beings, male and female, and then eventually only created them as one, a fused male and female together, and then later separated that being into male and female. So it's a very esoteric idea, much more depth is required for this, which we don't have time for right now, but that's the basic idea.
This is also difficult with those who hold that the first of Tishrei is the sixth day of creation.
Okay. Yeah, I'm overlooking that for now, but I understand what you're saying. Right. In other words, the world was really created from Kriyatu ex nihilo on the 25th of Elul. Right. Okay. Good. Okay. Weiter. V'la yirakos. Let's go. But that's actually a machlokus. V'la yirakos. That the Mishnah had also said that the first of Tishrei is Rosh HaShana for vegetables. Now, what does that mean? It's the the vegetables dip an apple in the honey. I mean, what does this mean? You can imagine a carrot dip, anyway. But la yirakos. So what does that mean? So Tana la yirakos v'la maisros v'la nedorim. So we have a brisa which tells us that it's Rosh Hashanah for vegetables, for meiser, and for vows. Now, maestros, we understand what that means because there's a halacha that you're not allowed to be toreim min hayashin al hachadash min hachadash al hayashin. You're not allowed to take produce from last year, combine it with produce from this year, and take trumas and maestros together. You have to tithe every year's produce separately. So that's what the word meiser means. So let's try to understand this. My ninhu meiser yerik. So what does the word yirakos mean? So the Gemara says it means tithing vegetables. So that's what it means. It means that when you tithe your cucumbers, the cucumbers from last year have to be tithed separately from the cucumbers of this year. But the Gemara says Hainu Maisra. So, but that's the second item in the brisa. Why does the brisa have to say both Yirakos and Maisra? So the Gemara answers Tana de Rabbanan Ukatani Dioraisa. The brisa wanted to tell you that both for tithes that are rabbinic, which is vegetables are only midrabbanan, you have to tithe them, but other produce, wheat, grain, grapes, and olives are subject to tithes midioraisa. That's what the second word of the brisa means. Velisni dioraisa bereisha. So the Gemara says, well, you should have at least listed maestros first because that's a halacha dioraisa, and then list the halacha derabbanan second. The Gemara says, "Aidi de chaviva le akdema." No, sometimes Chazal say this, sometimes the rabbinic law is even more beloved than the Torah law, because it's something that comes from Chazal, and it's something that they want to show such a preciousness, that such an endearment to, that they'll sometimes even list it before the Deoraisa law. So now the Gemara says, V'tana didan tana derabanan, b'kol shkein deoraisa. So now our Mishnah, which only says that it's Rosh HaShana for Yirakos, but it doesn't mention Maestros, why not? Because once you tell me that we're so machmir even for rabbinic tithes, that we don't allow you to tithe from last year and this year together, so kol shekain, you know that you can't tithe for when it comes to things that are subject to Meiser Deoraisa. Correct the Gemara Velisni Meiser. The Gemara's next question is, why did the Brisa have to say the word ma'asros in the plural? Just say it's Rosh Hashanah for ma'aser. The Gemara answers, Echad Meiser Behema Vechad Meiser Dagan, because there are two types of Meiser that are being referred to. One is tithing your animals, and one is tithing your produce. And in both cases, you can't tithe animals that are born from last year together with animals that are born from this year, and the same thing with produce. Velisna Yerik, so the Gemara now says, well, why then is the word Yerik in the plural? Just list, say, vegetable instead of vegetables. The Gemara answers, Trei Gavna Yerik. There are two types of vegetable, and it's telling you an incidental halacha, that because you know that every type of produce, you have to know when is it subject to tithing, when it is fully processed. In other words, when it's processed to the form where it is now ready to go to either the mill or to someone's pot, right? So at what point are vegetables considered to be fully processed? So it depends on the vegetable. There are certain vegetables that are sold in the marketplace in bunches. You have to put a band around them. So they only become subject to tithing when you put the band around them. But there are other kinds, let's say maybe carrots or celery, something like that. But there are other kinds of vegetables that you can't take lima beans and put a band around them. So those are things that are subject to tithing as soon as you pile them in a pile in the, I don't know what's it called, in the barn, right? Once you pile them in the barn, so then they become subject to tithe. So therefore, it's telling you Yerakos to tell you an incidental halacha that each vegetable is different as far as when it becomes subject to tithing based upon its processing. So Tana Rabbanan, Liket Yerek Erev Rosh HaShana Ad Shelo Tavo HaShemesh V'chazer V'liket Mishetavo HaShemesh Ein Tormin U'Ma'asrin Mizeh Al Zeh Lefi She'ein Tormin U'Ma'asrin Lo Min HaChadash Al HaYashan V'lo Min HaYashan Al HaChadash. So the Brisa tells me that now we're going to see, and also in just a moment, how do you determine whether a vegetable or a fruit is from this year or from last year? It also is going to depend on the fruit or vegetable. With most vegetables, we say that the criterion for whether it's from this year or next year or last year has to do with not when it's growing, but when it's being harvested. The moment you harvest the vegetable, the moment you pull the carrot out of the ground, that determines the year that it belongs to. So it's possible that the majority of the carrot grew before Rosh HaShana, but if I only pull the carrot out of the ground after Rosh Hashanah, it counts as part of the new year. That's only by vegetables, but we're going to see by grain that the halach is different. By grain, the criterion is when did it grow the first third of its growth. If it grew the first third of its growth before Rosh Hashanah, then it's part of last year's produce, even though the majority of it and the harvesting did not take place until after Rosh Hashanah.
Does it mean that the actual time that particular farmer did that, or that in general that's when it is harvested in agricultural terms?
I'm sorry, I don't understand what you're asking.
Well, I mean, is the determination of, let's say, a cucumber, whenever a cucumber, or maybe a cucumber are at different times, but there are particular vegetables that might be normally harvested, ready for picking at a certain juncture in time. Is that what they're talking about?
No, the criterion is when this particular farmer pulls the cucumber out of the ground.
Okay.
Right. So when the moment that cucumber is pulled out of the ground, that's the year, that defines the year that it belongs to. Okay? So therefore the Brisa tells me that if I pulled it out, I got a big cucumber patch, and I pulled out a bunch of cucumbers before Rosh Hashanah, and then the sun set, and Rosh Hashanah began, like the Yerushalmi says, then that Gentile comes along and he pulls out a bunch of other cucumbers. So I have to segregate the two sets of cucumbers, and I can't tithe one onto the other. Okay? So, im haisa shniya nichneses l'shlishis, shniya meiser rishon u'meiser sheni, shlishis meiser rishon u'meiser ani. And in the same vein, since we know that there are different years of the Shemitah cycle which are subject to different tithes, and let's just review. In the first, second, fourth, and fifth year of the Shemitah cycle, there are two types of meiser that you have to take from your produce. One is called Meiser Rishon, the first 10% which goes to the Levi, and then you take an additional 10%, and that's called Meiser Sheni, and you bring that up to Yerushalayim and consume it yourself. On the third and sixth years of the Shemitah cycle, the second 10% is not called Meiser Sheni, but is rather called Meiser Ani, and that additional 10% is given to the poor. Okay? So therefore, based on that halacha, if a person harvests his cucumbers, half of the cucumbers are harvested before Rosh Hashanah in year 2, and then the other half are harvested after Rosh Hashanah in year 3. So the first batch of cucumbers are subject to Meiser Rishon and Meiser Sheni, and the second batch of cucumbers are subject to Meiser Rishon and Meiser Ani. Okay? So the Gemara's question is, Minahani Mili. How do you know this? Now, what is the question? How do you know what? So Rashi tells us, how do you know that in the third and sixth years, there's no din of Meiser Sheni, that Meiser Sheni gets supplanted and replaced by Meiser Ani? So, Amar Reb Yeshua ben Levi, because it's based on a pasuk. Kisa chalel la'aser, es kol masar tivu asacha b'ashana ha'shalishis shenasa ma'aser. That when you finish taking meiser in the third year, the Torah then says, once you finished, v'nasata la'levi, lager la'yasam v'la'almana v'achalu v'sharecha v'saveyu. Then you shall give the remaining tithe to the poor in your community, to the Levi, to the Yasam, to the orphan, and to the widow, and let them eat with you. So that's how we know that there's a din of Meiser Ani. But Shana she'ein ba ela Meiser Echad. But it seems like the pasuk is telling you that there's only one Meiser that you take in year 3 in addition to Meiser Ani. So Haketzad Meiser Reshun o Meiser Ani o Meiser Sheni Yibatel. So therefore you infer from the pasuk, because it seems that there's only one Meiser in addition to this Meiser Ani that you're taking, that you give Meiser Rishon and you give Meiser Ani, and Meiser Sheni is supplanted in that year. O Eno Ela Af Meiser Rishon Ami Yibatel. Maybe you'll argue that no. Maybe you'll argue that Meiser Ani is the exclusive Meiser that you give in year 3, and you don't give any tithes other than Meiser Ani, and that even Meiser Rishon is supplanted. The Gemara says, Tamul Omar ve'el ha'leviyim tedaber ve'omar ta'alehem ki sikchu me'es b'nei Yisrael as-ma'aser shenasati lechem me'itam b'nachalaschem. The Torah here is talking about the Meiser that the Levi takes, and it talks about it in terms of being an inheritance. And that's the key word, benachalaschem. Hekishu akasav lanachala. Ma nachala ein la hefsek, af meiser rishon ein la hefsek. That just like an inheritance is perennial, it's not like I inherit in year 1 and in year 2 I don't inherit. It's not my inheritance anymore. Inheritance is constant and perennial. So too, every year is subject to meiser Rishon for the Levi. And that's how I know that Meiser Rishon is extant all 6 years out of the 6 years of the Shemitah cycle. And of course, not counting Shemitah, where everything becomes Hefker. So, Tanya Nami Hachi, we have a brisa to support this principle. And here we see a machlokas as to what the source text is, but the conclusion is still the same, that during year 3 and year 6, Meiser Ani replaces Meiser Sheni. Kisa Chalel Aser. The pasuk says that when you conclude your Meisers, then you should give on the 3rd year to the poor. Shana she'ein ba ela Meiser Echad, haketzad Meiser Rishon o Meiser Ani o Meiser Sheni Yibatel. So once again, we say that the pasuk implies that there's one additional Meiser during that year, and Meiser Ani is given in addition to that, so that must prove that Meiser Rishon is extant, but Meiser Sheni is supplanted. Yacholaf Meiser Rishon Ani Yibatel. You might think that maybe Meiser Ani is the exclusive Meiser of year 3. Tamul Omar Uva HaLevi. So there's another pasuk which tells me, and this pasuk is referring to the 3rd year, and it says that the Levi will come because he has no inheritance, together with the stranger, the orphan, the widow in your gates, v'achalu v'saveyu, and they shall eat and they will be sated. So the language of Uva HaLevi means that the Levi seems to have a certain right to come at any time he pleases. Kol zman sheba tein lo divrei Rabbi Yehuda, and therefore that implies that whenever he comes, you got to give him, even if he comes in year 3 and year 6, he's entitled to a special tithe that's exclusively for him, which is Meiser Rishon. That's how Rabbi Yehuda sees it. However, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer Einot Tzarech. He says, no, you don't need to learn it from there. You can learn it from the pasuk that we quoted in the previous brisa. Because Hareyu Omer ve'el alavim tedaber ve'omar ta'aleim ki sikchu me'es b'nei solas ha'maser shemasat lechem me'itam b'nachalaschem. You see that the Torah speaks about Meiser Rishon in terms of an inheritance. Hekishu akasav l'nachala manachla ein la hefsek af Meiser Rishon ein la hefsek. That just like inheritance is perennial without interruption, so too Meiser Rishon is perennial without any interruption. Fine. That concludes that discussion of how I know that Meiser Ani replaces Meiser Sheni in year 3 and year 6. Let us go weiter. We had said also that Tishrei is Rosh HaShana for Nidarim. That's what the Brisa had also said, that for vows. Now, what does that mean? It's Rosh HaShana for vows. We'll explain in just a moment. Tana Rabbanan. Hamudar hana mechaveru l'shana mona shnei masar chodesh miyom liyom. If a person takes a vow and he says, I'm not going to get any benefit for you for a year. So how do you mark the year? It's not 365 days. It's 12 months. 12 halachic months from the day that I took the vow, and after 12 months are over, 354 days later, then my vow is over. However, v'imamar l'shana zu, afilu lo amad ela be'esrim v'tisha be'elul kevin she'igi yom echad b'tishrei also lo shana. If, however, I say I'm not going to benefit from you this year, so then it'll depend how long the vow stands, depending upon when I took the vow. If I took the vow 6 months before Rosh Hashanah, so my vow lasts for 6 months. If I took the vow 1 day before Rosh Hashanah, even if I took the vow on the 29th of Elul, then my vow will only stand for 1 day, but it's still a valid vow, and I fulfilled the vow, and I can get benefit from you starting with Rosh Hashanah. And afilu l'man da'omer yom echad b'shana einu choshev shana litziri nafshi kabil alei v'hayitztar alei. And you'll recall that there was a machlokus on DAF Yud as to whether 1 day out of a year can count as anything substantive, and that was a discussion vis-a-vis the laws of Orla, because when it comes to the laws of Orla, you have to wait 3 years. We know that Rosh Hashanah is for the purposes of Orla as well. So let's say you plant something just a few days before Rosh Hashanah, so the Gemara had said that those few days count as year 1, and then starting with Rosh Hashanah is year 2, and then after year 3, you're allowed to benefit from the produce of the tree. That's the laws of Orla, right? But the question, there was a machlokas of, what if you plant on the 29th of Elul? So there's only 1 day out of that year 1. Does that count as a year or not? So there was one mandomer who says it doesn't count, because 1 day is not enough to count as a full year. But that's only true with the agricultural halacha. But when it comes to the laws of vows, everyone would agree that since the person took upon himself to abstain from you, he's fulfilled that. He's fulfilled his vow. Even if that abstinence is only for a day, he's fulfilled that abstinence, and therefore it counts. Frak the Gemara ve'ema Nisan. Maybe when the person took the vow, he meant, I'm not going to benefit from you this year. He meant to say until Rosh Chodesh Nisan, not until Rosh Chodesh Tishrei. So the Gemara answers, B'nedarim helach achar lashon b'nei adam. No, because when it comes to vows, you go according to the way people normally speak. And since people normally refer to the new year, right, when a guy comes over to you and says, Happy New Year, what does he mean? He means Rosh Hashanah. He doesn't mean Rosh Chodesh Nisan. He'll tell you Happy Passover if it's Rosh Chodesh Nisan. He's not going to say Happy New Year. So therefore, since people speak in the vernacular as referring to Rosh Hashanah as the New Year, therefore when he says, I'm not going to benefit from you for this year, he means until Rosh Hashanah. Tanan Hasan. Let's go back to the laws of agriculture in Meiser. Hatilsan mishatitzmach hatavua behazeisim mishaviyo shlish. So there's a Mishnah that says that when it comes to tilsan, which Rashi translates as fenugreek, it's a type of herb. So if you want to determine what year it belongs to, vis-a-vis the laws of Meiser, like we've been talking about all along, so as soon as it blossoms, or sprouts probably is the more correct term, as soon as it sprouts, it's considered to have grown, and therefore belongs to the year when it sprouted. But when it comes to other types of produce, and here we're talking about tvu and zaysim, which Rashi says the word tvu refers to both grain and grapes, and zaysim refers to olives. Those are the things that are subject to tithes midioraisa. All they have to do is grow 1/3 of the way, and once they grow 1/3 of the way of their full growth, then that's considered to be the year which they grew in. So if they grew 1/3 of the way before Rosh Hashanah, then even if you don't harvest them until after Rosh Hashanah, they're considered to be part of last year's produce. So, my mishatitzmach. So the Gemara says, what does it mean when it talks about fenugreek sprouting? What does that mean? Mishatitzmach lizroim. When it sprouts for seeds. Tosfos explains that what that means is that if you were to pull out this very immature fenugreek out of the ground, but it was mature enough such that if you threw it into water or into other dirt, it would grow again, it would be able to produce another fenugreek plant, so then it's mature enough for the purposes of considered to having been grown during that year when you pulled it out. Now let's go back to the case of tvu ve'azeisim, mishayaviyu shlish. That when it grows 1/3 of its way, when we talk about the 3 types, the grain, the grapes, and the olives, they grow 1/3 of their way. That's considered to be fully grown for the purposes of Meiser. So minahani mila.
For a Shemitah year, does that mean that that's...
We're going to get to that in just a second. We'll get to that. It's an excellent question. So first of all, how do we know this? How do we know that if it's grown 1/3 of the way, it's considered to be part of that year? So Amar Rav Asi, Amar Rav Yochanan, Umatuba Mishmei de Rabbi Yossi Hagalili, Amar Kra, based on the following pasuk: Mikate Sheva Shanim b'moed shenasa Shemitah b'chag HaSukkos. The Torah, in the very end of the Torah in Sefer Devarim, talks about one of the very last mitzvahs of the Torah, which is the mitzvah of Hakel. What's the mitzvah of Hakel? Once every 7 years, the Melech, the king of Israel, has to read the Sefer Torah for the Jewish people in the Beis HaMikdash in a very public way. So the Torah describes it as being on Sukkot after the Shemitah year. That's when he's supposed to do it. On Sukkot after the Shemitah year. The whole discussion about when on Sukkot, but anyway, that's the law. Now, Shnas HaShemitah Mayavidite B'Chag HaSukkos Shminisi. So the question is, why does the Torah call the Sukkot after the Shemitah year part of the Shemitah year? It should call it the 8th year, or it should call it the first year of the new cycle, because Sukkot is after Rosh HaShana. Rosh HaShana is the cutoff date for Shemitah. So Elolomar Lecha Kol Tavua Shehivia Shlish Bashvias Lifnei Rosh HaShana Atanoig Bo Minak Shvias Bashminis. It's to tell you the following halacha, that any grain that begins growing before Rosh Hashanah in a Shemitah year, as long as it's grown a third of the way on the Shemitah year, even if it finishes growing after the Shemitah year, it's still considered to be part of the Shemitah year, and it still has the Kedusha Shvius, and it's going to have all of the limitations of Kedusha Shvius. Now, where do you see that from the pasuk? Because when you harvest the grain on Sukkot, it's full growth. If it's harvestable on Sukkot 2 weeks after Rosh Hashanah, it means that it grew a third of its way by Rosh Hashanah, as the Gemara will speak out in just a second. So Amrle Rabbi Zera le Rabbi Asi le Ravasi the Dilma lo Ayil Klal Ukama Rachmana Tishamet V'Teis Lad Chag HaSukkos. How do you know that that's the import of the pasuk? Maybe what the pasuk is telling you is that you have to be machmir with the laws of Shemitah in general, and that anything that even begins growing after the Shemitah year until Sukkot is still all considered to be part of the Shemitah year. In other words, maybe like Rashi points out, "Va'afilu lo hischilu lihispashel b'shvius kamarachmona mitzvah shvius limashech hisuri at Chag HaSukkos milach harosh v'liktzor." All the Torah is telling you is that whatever restrictions as far as working the soil apply to the Shemitah year apply all the way until Sukkot of the following year. Maybe that's all the Torah is telling you. It's got nothing to do with patterns of growth and what year you consider produce to be a part of. The Gemara says, "Lo sal kedaitach t'chsiv." No, you're not going to think that based on another pasuk. The Torah says, in reference to Sukkot, "V'chag ha'asif b'tzeis hashana," that the Torah talks about Sukkot, and it says as follows in Parshas Mishpatim. It says, "V'chag ha'asif b'tzeis hashana," that the festival of gathering at the end of the year, be'ospecha es ma'asecha min hasada, when you gather in your farming from the field. So notice a couple of things that are unusual. Number one, Sukkot is referred to as the end of the year, when it's really at the beginning of the new year. Number two, the word ospecha, the verb of gathering, of asifa, is mentioned twice in this pasuk. So my asif. So why does it mention the word asif? Ilay machag haba bisman asifa. If it's just to tell me that this is a holiday that's celebrated at the time of ingathering of the sheaves, haksiv ba'aspecha. That the Torah says explicitly that it's the holiday celebrated at the time when you gather things in. Elamai asif katzir. But rather, what is the word asif alluding to? If it's not referring to gathering, it must be referring to harvesting, and it's telling you as follows: the kimlahu l'Rabbanan dechol tavua sheniktzra b'chag biyadua shehivia shlish lifnei Rosh HaShana the kakari la b'tzei Hashana. The rabbis knew, based on their observations of agricultural systems, that any grain that is harvested because it's mature on Sukkot has already reached a third of its maturity by Rosh Hashanah, and therefore the reason why it's called, and that's why Sukkot is called the end of the year. It's called the end of the year because that which is harvested in Sukkot belongs to the previous year. Why? Because it grew a third of the way on Rosh Hashanah. And that's how I know that when it comes to the primary types of produce, grain, grapes, and olives, once they grow a third of the way, they're considered to be part of the year at that moment when they grew a third of the way. We'll continue Mirz Hashem tomorrow. Have a wonderful day.